Good morning. I'm Greg Cooley, one of the Sunday school teachers here at First United Methodist Church in Corinth, Mississippi. Thanks a lot for joining in again. We're going to continue with last week's question, what does a genuine Christian life look like? And frame that within the information and the instruction we get from Romans chapter 12. And as you remember, I broke it down into four things we're going to look at from Romans chapter 12. First of all, our thoughts. I'm going to talk about those today. Now, I'm going to tell you, today's session of 20 minutes or so is not going to replace your prayer life. It's not going to replace going to the counselor or calling the psychologist from time to time or getting counseling from your pastor or Sunday school teacher. No, or family. But it maybe will help you as you work through your thought life or the thoughts that are part of your life. So the first thing we look at in Romans is our thoughts, what we should do with our thoughts, how we should think of our thoughts. Secondly, we're going to look at our self-perceptions, our ego. What do we think of ourselves and what are we admonished to do related to that? How about our relationships? Now, if I go to my thoughts, then my own personal perceptions, and then how I relate to other people, I'm starting to really get into your life, aren't I? And then lastly, our fight with evil. And our fight with evil affects all three of these, doesn't it? Because evil thoughts can hurt my thought life, can turn into actions that would affect my perception and how I project myself to others and how I perceive others, and then ultimately my relationships, my fight with evil. And to a certain extent, for some of us, isn't that what all of this is about? Making sure that we have a grasp on how we're supposed to relate to God and then relate to evil is one of the really important tenets of the Christian faith. And that's why we're doing this study anyway, isn't it? So let's jump right into it again. Romans chapter 12, verse 1. I appeal to you, brothers, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies and minds as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. Now stop. Am I living my life so it is holy with an H and then holy with a W? So holy, as good as I can do it, that's with the H. And then with the W, that's wholly, completely acceptable to God. Acceptable to God. Not acceptable to society. I will be, I think. Not acceptable to my mother-in-law or my friends or my next door neighbor or my boss that I want to impress. I don't think those should be the things I'm shooting to be acceptable to. Those are not the entities I want to be acceptable to initially, mostly, wholly. If I shoot to be acceptable to God wholly, those things will take care of themselves. So the first thing I need to think in the morning, based on my thoughts, is how can I live today wholly acceptable to God? So that needs to be the overlying theme here. How am I going to control my thoughts? How am I going to address my self-perceptions? How am I going to address my relationships from the point of view of being acceptable to God? Oh, I know what Hollywood tells me I need to do related to my relationships. Oh, I know what Hollywood tells me that I need to do when it comes to my self-perception. And I know what society tells me I need to do related to my thoughts. But are those acceptable to God? Well, let's continue to read. It is my reasonable duty, my reasonable worship, my reasonable lifestyle that I need to choose to be wholly acceptable to God. That's what we're learning here in verse 1. Do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Remember last week we talked about transform, being changed? So that you can then discern the will of God and know what it means to be wholly acceptable to God. And this is good, and this is acceptable, and this is perfect. So let's get into my thoughts here. For by the grace that's been given to everyone among you, do not think thoughts of yourself more highly than you ought. But think with sober judgment. So, two things there related to my thoughts. First of all, not thinking more highly of myself, my self-perception. In other words, being self-absorbed. He's telling me not to be self-absorbed. He's telling me what? To be sober in my thoughts. Now, does this relate to my consumption of alcohol and drugs? Well, sometimes, but not wholly. What is this talking about? Me being sober in my thoughts. Maybe when I'm sober, I think about things before I think them, or while I'm thinking them, or after I've thought them. I'm aware. When you're sober, aren't you more aware of what goes on around you? Isn't that why we have the DUI laws that we have? Because we want you, dude, to be more aware when you're behind the wheel. And when they stop you and you've been swerving, what do? They do a sobriety test to check how sober you are. Can you walk this line? Can you answer these questions? Can you follow this? All of those things, trying to find out what your awareness is. Life tests your thought awareness every day. So what can we get from this about our thoughts and our thought awareness? Well, part of your thought awareness needs to be explained by these 3 points. Number 1, some thoughts are normal. Now, my mother was not a fearful person. I've got lots of pictures to prove it. I got one picture. She was 5 feet 6 inches tall, standing behind the newspaper office, where a local policeman had told her to go and get her picture taken so they could put it in the newspaper. Now, it's pretty significant when a local policeman comes along and you're involved in an activity and the policeman says, you need to go get your picture taken for the paper. Well, why was my mother's picture in the paper? Because she's standing there. And they had tied a string around the rattlers of a 7-foot-tall mountain rattler that my mother had killed on the city streets of Russellville, Alabama. My mother did this, not with her car. She's driving down the street. I vividly remember it. I'm about 6 years old. And this snake is going across the street. And there are children over here at a playground. My mother pulls into the next driveway, runs into the carport of somebody she did not know. Now, would a fearful person do this? Absolutely not. So she runs into this carport of somebody she does not know and finds a shovel, runs back out. I'm watching all this. All this is taking place in front of me because I hate to admit it, but I was born back in the late 50s, early 60s. So when I was 6 years old, there weren't a lot of laws about being buckled up and there weren't a lot of laws about booster seats or children's seats at that time, so I was sitting in the front seat unbuckled. I confess that. That probably is another indicator my mother wasn't scared. Probably should have been more prepared in certain situations, but she wasn't scared. So all of this is taking place in front of me. She runs down. She and the rattlesnake get into it. Right there in the curb and gutter behind the newspaper office in northwest Alabama. And she wins. She kills the snake. My brothers, I have two younger brothers, they're in the back seat. One is 4 and one is about 2.5 at the time. They are screaming. They are scared. They have seen their mother and a snake this long have a confrontation. But Mom wins. And so a local policeman comes along and he tells her, "Dude, that's a record breaker. We need to take a picture of that." So they knock on the back door of the newspaper office, and a newspaper reporter comes out and said, wait, let me go get my camera, such as they had in 1965, 66. And he runs back in, and he gets the camera and comes out and takes a picture of my mother. My mother's on the front page of the local newspaper. 2 or 3 things happened in that confrontation that would tell you my mother was not afraid. However, the last few years of her life, because of medications and because of the onset of dementia, my mother became very fearful. To the extent, in the latter part of her life, she was diagnosed as being paranoid. And I'll have to agree with that. That woman with that fight in her when she was in her late 20s and early 30s, by the time she got in her late 70s and early 80s, was afraid of her own shadow. And my mother lost the ability to determine and differentiate between dreams and reality. So if she went to sleep and she dreamed that there were tigers in the building, and you know you've had these kinds of dreams, when she woke up, she was still experiencing that, filled with the fright and the fear. And those things that were happening to her were normal, natural, physical. There are some thoughts that happen to you, fear, anxiety, stress, that in and of themselves are part of your natural defense mechanism. Or they may be part of your diagnosis. They're natural. They're normal. Don't think you're going to the bad place because you have a bad thought every now and then, or because there's a thought in your mind that you're not proud of. Some thoughts are normal, natural. Some are not. Second thing, some thoughts are good. Not all thoughts are bad. Some thoughts are good. Some thoughts are about hope and happiness and gladness. Yeah. Some of you went into business because you had a thought one morning while you were drinking coffee. And 30 years later, you've got all these employees and all of this revenue, and you've done all this good for mankind. Some thoughts are good, and we ought to be proud of them. Thirdly, some thoughts are bad. Some thoughts that you let come through, maybe they were natural and they started out as an anxiety or they started out as a fear or a stress, but you've held on to them. First mistake. When you're being sober with your thoughts, once you've had a natural thought, this happens a lot of times related to the unfaithful activities of some people in marriage. You look at something and you lust for it, that may be initially natural. You hang on to it, not a sober decision. Some thoughts become bad when they fester. when we allow them to fester. And we're told here that we're given certain graces. Let me read verse 3 again. For by the grace that's given to you, I say to everyone among you, do not think of yourself more highly than you should, but think soberly, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned to you. Some of you are more mature in your graces and your faith than others, aren't you? But all of us should be trying to mature and go on to perfection and understand some of these natural thoughts I have. Yeah, Greg, I have to agree with you and admit I hold on to some of them a little too long and let them fester, and they become bad. So if you're going to be sober in your judgments and your thoughts, what kinds of bad thoughts do you need to be aware that you may be having? Number one, you may be having a bad thought that is a doorway to evil. That lustful thought? Momentarily, it may fulfill you a little bit. Maybe give you a burst of energy or adrenaline. But eventually, it is a doorway to evil. If you are sober as you're aware of your thoughts, you will sweep it away. You'll find something else to put in your consciousness, and you will remind yourself not to look at her like that again, not to put yourself in that situation again, not to allow yourself to have those kinds of conversations with him again. That's how you'll handle it, and you will grow in your maturity, not only as a spiritual person, but as a physical person who is controlling their thoughts. You need to be aware of those that are hurtful. You also need to be aware of those that are the doorway to evil. And this hurtfulness and this evil is not just a thing you're thinking about. Remember, we're not just supposed to think about ourselves. What about the doorway to evil and hurtfulness that I can have that affects others? So initially, I'm going to run my thoughts through a filter. I had a good Bible teacher one time who explained it like this. How many of you have ever been through security at the airport? Or security going in a major stadium recently, since 9/11. Now, what are they looking for? Foreign objects, bad things, things that could hurt you and hurt others, right? And in fact, I do not resent it. Now, sometimes I'm in a hurry, and I wish some of the people who are doing the security were more efficient. But by and large, on the whole, I'm glad that we look at all those bags that people tote on the airplane. Some of those people are sitting beside me or putting things in the overhead compartment above my family. I want to make sure that security's doing their job. And what are they doing? They're filtering through. That's what that mechanism does. When you put your bag on that thing and it goes inside to be scanned, what is it doing? It's filtering through, it's looking through, it's identifying. And if anything there is suspicious, boom, a couple of alarms go off, you're going to get pulled to the side, and they may touch you. And definitely they're going to touch your stuff. Maybe I need to use that as an example of what I need to be better at within my own brain, within my own soul, related to some of these thoughts I have. If they're evil and they're hurtful to me or others, just like the scanner through security, I need to have an alarm go off. In my premarital counseling, they told us that at the end of every day, the point is always to stay in love. Throughout every argument, throughout every disagreement, we ought to be trying to stay in love. I think at the end of every day, in the middle of every day, maybe in the middle of every thought, not only should I have that within me related to my relationship to my wife, maybe I should have that within my spirit as I relate to God. I need to stay in love, stay in respect, stay in connection. Allow Him to help me analyze my thoughts. Are they evil? And are they hurtful? One last aspect of bad thoughts I want to talk about, and that is they may be controlling. If I allow my thoughts to control me, they will become actions. They will at least become attitudes. And if I allow a bad thought to control the situation, and I don't control the thought, either one of these two things is going to happen over time. I assure you. You have a thought, either you control it like the security mechanism and it gets kicked out and you make a mental note of it, and the next time it comes through, you know how to handle it. You control the thought, or eventually the thought controls you. That's the way it is. Now, as I said, this conversation is not going to replace your counseling. It's not going to replace your relationship with God. It's not going to replace your relationship with the Holy Spirit that is supposed to be there as a comforter and an advisor to you continually. But hopefully, from the point of view of Scripture and logic, we now are more aware that we should be, according to the gifts and graces given to us, and according to the admonition of the Scripture, we should be more conscious of our thoughts. We just shouldn't go to and fro and be knocked about by things we think are natural. I've had my fellow friends tell me, when I go to the beach, I wear sunglasses, the kind with the wrap-around frames. Why? Because it's only natural that I want to look at the sights. The sights of what? Well, the girls that are going by. While you sit with your wife? You've paid money to come on a vacation. With whom? The person who just walked by that you're lusting for? Or the person right here that at the end of the day, the point is supposed to be that you stay in love with? And you're trying to hide? First of all, do you really kid yourself and think you're hiding? Huh? Because if that sight is good enough, you ain't going to just keep your head in one position, buddy. Your head's going to trail along. Your wife, she's not unaware. And also, the point I want to make to guys who tell me that, because it's just natural, do you not think she's also looking? Or could be? We need to sometimes ask ourselves, how do we sound? And does that really make very much logical sense? And is it right? And is it good? Or is it potentially evil and hurtful? Oh, your wife may be a self-confident person and says, look all you want, buddy. You're going home with me. Maybe she says that. But I'm going to tell you, you probably hurt her feelings. She may not admit it. But over time, you've had a thought that may be natural in the beginning, that you've let fester. And it's gone into one of these categories. Is it a doorway to evil? Is it hurtful to others? Is it controlling of you? Let us be aware today, as we face the day and deal with the day, that God practically wants to be involved in your life all the way to the thought level, so that we're more sober and we're more aware, and we're more prepared as we face this day as God's people, as we relate to God and allow God to relate to us. God bless you.